My Lords, I rise with a very long list of amendments before me to speak to, and I'm going to begin by very briefly addressing the Noble Lord Currie of Kirkale and indeed the Noble Lady Baroness Mackintosh of Pickering as response to my noble friend's Amendment 32. I should perhaps begin, first of all, by thanking the Noble Lord Currie of Kirkale for offering his support for my Amendment 11 on soils, and I would agree with him that it is rather odd that it's not in the initially on the face of the bill. However, on Amendment 32, I would first of all point out that this amendment doesn't seek to impose a diet on anyone. It sets a target to head the national diet in a certain direction. What the Noble Lord Currie of Kirkale said about methane, yes, it is shorter lasting in terms of its impact on the climate. It's also more than a score higher than the impact of carbon dioxide. And when we consider the fact that we have an emergency that we have to ensure that we stay below 1.5 above industrial warming right now, the next 10 years are absolutely crucial. So methane emissions now are particularly crucial. And I would also stress, my noble friend will not forgive me if I don't stress, that we very much understand that animal agriculture has its place in the British landscape, an important place in the British landscape, but what we have to do is start by tackling factory farming for many reasons, from antimicrobial resistance going through to the point that this is food waste, to be feeding perfectly good food that people could eat to animals to produce much less food as a result. Now I get to the list that I actually started on, which is, very briefly, I'm just going to speak to Amendment 10 in the name of the Noble Lord Randall of Uxbridge on light pollution. The Green Group, we would have attached our signature to this had there been space to do so. This clearly is a huge issue, and Noble Lord Randall referred to the whole, what's been referred to as Insectageddon, the huge loss of insect numbers and insect species, and certainly light pollution is part of that. And I would also point out how this very much is a case in terms of joined-up government. So much of the light that we actually emit, that we pollute our skies with, is utterly unnecessary. The French government, for example, has brought in a law that says neon shop signs have to be switched off between midnight and dawn. Now, that undoubtedly has benefits for the natural world. I'm sure it also has huge benefits for people who live in flats above shops, people who live in the environment. What we're talking about is making the environment better for people and nature. I will also very briefly offer support for the general intentions of the Noble Lord Harries of Pentragarth in terms of focusing on trees, while taking on board the comments of the Noble Lady Baroness Mackintosh of Pickering, that we need the right tree in the right place, to use the buzz phrase. And I think we talk a great deal about tree planting, but it's really important that we think about natural regeneration of trees, because that's one of the ways in which nature will help ensure that we do get the right tree in the right place. And I also think we need to talk a great deal more about agroforestry and the possibility of forage crops, and indeed crops producing human food, nut trees, fruit trees, etc., mixed into our existing agricultural systems. I now, however, get to the three amendments that I really wanted to talk about here, and I apologise, my lords, this is going to be a rather long speech. But these are three very short, but I believe very important amendments. And I come first to Amendment 7, which appears in my name. And this changes one of the proposed targets as set down by the government. And the target as expressed by the government is for resource efficiency and waste reduction. Now, I'm calling for the words resource efficiency to be replaced by reduction in resource use. For the current wording essentially says we'll continue to treat the planet as a mine and a dumping ground, but we'll do it less wastefully. What I'm suggesting is that the law acknowledges that we cannot have infinite growth on a finite planet, that a circular economy is a necessary but not sufficient condition for a sustainable world, that we have to, in the terms of the neat video, The Story of Stuff, which has been around since 2007, have to have less stuff in our lives. Now, I refer to an important report I'd encourage noble lords to lead from the Green Alliance, which points out that resource use drives half of the world's climate emissions and 90% of nature destruction around the world. And the UK's use of resources, both renewable and finite, is twice the level considered sustainable. When it comes to natural resources alone, the UK uses 3 times as much as the planet can sustainably provide. That report, my lords, written by what's not by any means a radical green group, calls for resource use to be halved. Now, the UK's material footprint was estimated as 971 million tonnes in 2018. That's equivalent to 14.6 tonnes per person. In 1997, 40% of that came from domestic extraction. That's now fallen to 27% in 2018. What we're doing is taking a huge amount of resources from the world, far more resources than the world can actually bear. Now, I would stress that cutting resource use doesn't have to mean a lesser quality of life. In fact, when we think about the damage that stuff's doing, whether the ocean's turned into a plastic soup, the planet heated dangerously and soils destroyed to produce food being wastefully fed to animals, which then produces health-damaging junk food, reducing resource use can considerably improve our quality of life, not just using it better, but using less of it. And really, there is no alternative. In a debate in the Finance Bill earlier this month, Lord Agnew of Alton, for the Treasury, responded to my remarks along these lines by pointing to the book More from Less by Andrew McAfee, which claims that technology is enabling dematerialisation of growth. Yet that, as many critics have pointed out, that book ignores the fact that very often material use and exploitation has been exported, not replaced, and the acceleration of planned obsolescence means that more efficient use of resources has very often not meant less use of resources. Now, Lord Agnew pointed us to the US Geological Survey, figures pointing to 72 resources, saying only 6 had passed their peak. But that's a reflection of what the known reserves are. But what about the damage done to people and nature by extracting them? Mining is, by its very nature, inevitably destructive. And in a world suffering a pandemic of environmental ill health and the biodiversity emergency, more destruction tips us over multiple planetary boundaries, a concept Lord Agnew's response suggests the Treasury has yet to grasp. Now, I'm well aware that the Noble Lord the Minister will find his work cut out in tackling the Treasury on these issues. But I would point out that if this government wants to be, as it so often tells us, world-leading, the European Parliament has demanded that the EU reduce resource use by 2030 and bring it within planetary boundaries, which means cutting by 2/3 by 2050. That's the target set by the European Parliament. So if we're going to be world-leading, that's where this bill should be going. I'm well aware that running the country for the economy, instead of running the economy for the well-being of the country, is deeply ingrained, but that's a challenge for the Noble Lord the Minister to take on. So I come now to the 2 other amendments that appear in my name. And before I do, I want to refer back to a comment made in the first group by the Noble Lady Baroness Mackintosh of Pickering, who said that we're really inadequately exploring the relationship between the Agriculture Bill, the Trade Bill and the Environment Bill. And I actually had a meeting last week with farmers and farming advisors who were basically expressed to me exasperation and frustration because they were struggling to understand what the government's intentions were in that process. And what these 2 amendments that I'm about to refer to attempt to deal with some of those issues. So I come to Amendment 11, Soils, and I hope I'm going to get this through. First of all, I want to express my great thanks to the Noble Lord Whitty for attaching his name to this amendment, and I want to thank the Noble Earl of Caithness, the Noble Lord Curry and the Noble Lord Randall of Uxbridge for expressing their support for this amendment. As the Noble Lord Randall said, it's astonishing that this is not on the face of the bill to start off with. And I want to quote Thomas Jefferson. I quote, "While the farmer holds the title to the land, it actually belongs to all the people because civilization itself rests on the soil." And I refer to a few points made in a report on the state of environment soil from the Environment Agency from June 2019. And I think it's really telling that it says there is insufficient data on the health of our soils and investment is needed in soil monitoring. It's very clear that we don't know enough And if we set a target, that's going to create a framework where we actually need to do the measuring. In some ways, perhaps it's a bit chicken and egg, but let's get this started because it clearly needs to happen. Now, I'm well aware that some may look at many of the issues affecting soils and say, well, testing for water and air will address some of those issues. But there are many issues with soil that measures that might address water and air quality won't address. And one of the very obvious one of these is the issue of soil compaction. Almost 4 million hectares of soil, I'm back to the Environment Agency report, 4 million hectares of soil are at risk of compaction in England and Wales. That has impacts on fertility as well as on water and flooding. Over 2 million hectares of soil are at risk of erosion in England and Wales. We have, of course, the carbon stores in soil that are absolutely crucial, but we also have a situation where intensive agriculture has caused arable soils to lose 40 to 60% of their organic carbon. We have, through the spreading of organic material, and we've had recently in Cumbria some horrific cases where farmers have suffered huge damage from the spreading of what they thought was organic fertiliser on their soil. It's caused huge contamination of everything from pharmaceuticals to heavy metals to a range of other contaminants. We have 300,000 hectares contaminated in the UK of contaminated soil. So I think it's really very clear that we have to have the government with a target: air, soil and water. There is a very clear, obvious logic to have targets in all of those areas. So I come finally, and sorry, I am aware I've spoken for some time, my lords, to Amendment 14, which in some ways is related to this, but it raises a whole new area of science that I believe the government really needs to be paying more attention to, the world needs to be paying more attention to, and that is the management of nitrogen. Now, again, noble lords might say, well, this, that seems to fit within soils. In some way it does. But I would point out that this is a fast-growing international area. In fact, what we have is the International Nitrogen Management System project set up by the UN a decade ago. And it was set up with the aim of doing what the IPCC did for carbon emissions, of setting global targets for nitrogen. Now, to put this in context, and noble lords who want to know more about this, I'd point to an article in Nature called The Nitrogen Emergency: How to Fix Our Forgotten Environmental Crisis from last month. Now, this points out that on land, we should, to fit within the world's planetary limits, only be fixing 62 million tonnes of nitrogen a year on land. We are currently fixing at least 300 million tonnes of nitrogen each year, 5 times. Now, the International Nitrogen Management System had a very large international meeting in 2018, and they thought they should set a target around that figure that I just cited, but they decided that it was politically impossible to set that target. So they instead set a global target of halving nitrogen waste by 2030. Now, it's worth saying, and this fits in very much with the needs of farmers, applying nitrogen, fixing nitrogen, of course, has huge costs. And the nitrogen efficiency used by farmers around the world now has fallen from 50% in 1961 to 42% today. We think about progress, actually we're going backwards very largely in terms of our efficiency of nitrogen use. So there's a UN target, the Colombo Declaration. Only 14 countries have signed up to this. So nitrogen is a separate issue. It's something I would really urge the government to consider, if not including in this bill, consider taking much more action on. Because nitrogen, very briefly, it means huge ocean dead zones. It means huge amounts of air pollution, something my noble friend will be addressing in other aspects of the bill. It means soil acidification, it means ozone depletion, it means problems with alkaline air, which actually causes massive damage to eat away at the ozone layer. So, my lords, we need to make this bill a lot better, and our debate in the first group of amendments we were talking about this. This group of amendments is really where we start to concretely see how we can make this bill larger and stronger. There's amendments here with some very serious force, some very serious detail behind it. I don't necessarily expect the Noble Lord the Minister to respond in detail to everything I've said today, but I really hope, in terms of nitrogen, the government will. In terms of soil, that the government will see the argument coming from all sides of the House, including particularly from the Noble Lord's own side of his House, that soil has to be there. We need to greatly improve this bill, and this group gives us some really important ways for doing it. Thank you, my Lords.